In the early hours of January 23rd, reports began circulating that, if confirmed, would represent one of the most dangerous escalation points in North American history. Claims that United States aircraft conducted airstrikes against cartel-linked targets inside Mexican territory, an action that, if true, would mark a fundamental shift from covert cooperation and law, enforcement assistance into open military action across a sovereign border. According to initial statements and rapidly developing reports, the alleged strikes targeted facilities described as cartel laboratories, logistics warehouses, and leadership compounds in the Mexican states of Sinaloa and Sonora, regions long associated with organized criminal networks but never before subjected to acknowledged U.S. air operations. Washington framed the reported activity as part of counter-narcotics and national security efforts, while Mexican officials stated that unauthorized munitions fell on Mexican soil, triggering emergency security protocols. The Mexican president described those reports as an act of invasion and warned that a response would follow if sovereignty was violated, language that alone signaled a dramatic escalation even before facts were fully established. In geopolitical terms, the significance of such reports lies not in whether every detail is immediately verified, but in what the perception of cross-border strikes activates within both governments. Modern wars rarely begin with formal declarations. They begin when one side believes a red line has been crossed, and the other believes escalation is justified. If U.S. aircraft did strike targets inside Mexico, even under the justification of counter-cartel operations, it would instantly collapse the long-standing framework that separates law enforcement cooperation from military intervention. For decades, Washington and Mexico have shared intelligence, coordinated arrests, and conducted joint operations indirectly, carefully preserving the appearance and reality of Mexican sovereignty. Airstrikes would shatter that balance. From Mexico's perspective, such action would transform criminal enforcement into territorial violation, forcing leadership to respond or risk appearing unable to defend the nation. From the U.S. perspective, the logic would be framed around necessity, urgency, and domestic pressure to demonstrate strength against cartels blamed for violence and narcotics flows. This is how escalation logic feeds itself. Even limited, targeted strikes create political momentum that narrows options on both sides. Mexican forces reportedly moved to heightened alert status, activating air defense systems and reinforcing key regions, not because war was desired, but because uncertainty demands preparation. When militaries mobilize, misunderstandings multiply. Aircraft on alert interpret radar contacts differently. Border incidents escalate faster. Civilian air traffic becomes riskier. Every movement carries meaning. Reports of civilian casualties, even if later revised or clarified, add an emotional dimension that accelerates escalation beyond rational calculation. Once civilians are perceived to be harmed, restraint becomes politically costly. Calls for retaliation grow louder. International attention intensifies. Emergency meetings are requested. Diplomatic language hardens. Whether or not every reported strike is confirmed in detail, the narrative itself creates consequences. This is the danger zone of modern conflict, where perception moves faster than verification, and leaders must respond in real time to protect credibility. If confirmed, the use of air power would represent a point of no return in bilateral relations, not because it guarantees war, but because it fundamentally changes the framework within which both governments operate. Cooperation becomes suspicion, silence becomes weakness, delay becomes risk. At that point, de-escalation requires extraordinary political courage and mutual trust, both of which are in short supply during crises fueled by domestic pressure, media amplification, and historical grievances. This is how conflicts begin, not with clear intentions, but with actions that force reaction before reflection is possible. If such an escalation path continues, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate border region and enter the realm of systemic instability, where regional security, trade, migration, and alliance credibility all become entangled. A confirmed U.S. airstrike inside Mexico would force the Mexican government into an impossible position: respond and risk further escalation, or refrain and face internal political collapse. Neither option preserves stability. Retaliation does not require symmetrical force. It can take diplomatic, economic, legal, or proxy forms, each designed to impose cost without triggering full-scale war. The United States, in turn, would face its own narrowing set of choices. Once military action is acknowledged, walking it back becomes difficult, without appearing to concede error. Domestic audiences expect justification, deterrence, and follow-through. Allies watch closely, not to judge morality, but to assess predictability. Adversaries observe for weakness, inconsistency, or overreach. In this environment, even restraint is interpreted strategically. International institutions would inevitably be drawn in, not because they can stop escalation, but because crisis demands forms for signaling. Emergency meetings, condemnations, and calls for restraint become part of the theater of escalation management. Yet history shows that once force is used across a recognized border, The threshold for further action drops dramatically. What was once unthinkable becomes discussable. What was once unacceptable becomes conditional. The language shifts from prevention to management. Border regions become militarized. Intelligence assessments assume worst-case scenarios. Accidental encounters become more likely. A single misinterpreted radar signal, a pilot's split-second decision, or a localized clash can cascade upward faster than leaders can intervene. This is not because leaders desire war, but because systems built for deterrence and response are poor at absorbing ambiguity. The strategic environment surrounding North America has long relied on the assumption that the USC-Mexico relationship, regardless of tension, would never cross into open military confrontation. That assumption underpins trade agreements, migration frameworks, and regional security planning. Remove it, even temporarily, and uncertainty spreads through markets, supply chains, and diplomatic relationships. Investors reassess risk, border commerce slows, travel advisories multiply, the cost of insurance rises. None of this requires sustained fighting. It requires only the perception that escalation is possible. This is why modern conflicts are so dangerous. They do not need to be large to be destabilizing. They need only to disrupt expectations. If the reported events are confirmed, the most important question will not be who struck whom, but whether both governments can create an off-ramp before momentum overrides control. Off-ramps require face-saving narratives, third-party mediation, and mutual acknowledgement of limits. They require leaders to absorb domestic criticism in exchange for stability. They require time, which crises rarely provide. If they fail, the situation hardens into a new normal defined by militarized borders, constant alerts, and the ever-present risk of miscalculation. This is how wars in the modern era begin, not with sweeping invasions, but with incremental actions that make restraint appear dangerous and escalation appear necessary. Whether this moment becomes a footnote or a turning point depends entirely on what happens next, how leaders communicate, and whether institutions designed to manage crisis are still trusted. What is certain is that once the idea of cross-border airstrikes enters the realm of possibility, the strategic environment is permanently altered. Even if de-escalation occurs, the precedent remains, the trust is damaged, and the margin for error is reduced. That is the true danger of escalation, not the immediate impact, but the long shadow it casts over every decision that follows.